Well, hi everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and to do this event with the Irvington Historical Society. They were a fabulous resource for me, and the volunteers gave me fantastic assistance when I was researching the Irvington part of this story. So I'm very grateful to them for that, and I'm delighted to be here. One thing I should say right at the top is, you may notice I say Wendell rather than Wendell, which I think probably most of you would say. Just when I was just researching this story, it just got stuck in my head in the British way, Wendell. So yes, I hope you can overlook that. So I'm going to put some slides up here and we'll talk through them. I should also explain, excuse me, I'm just recovering from a bout of COVID. So if my voice sounds slightly crackly or I'm sucking on lozenges, that's why. So let's get into, here we go. So the Weird Wendels. Now the Weird Wendels is just a name that the family were given by the press, which kind of stuck. It is an epic story. I was always amazed by the fact it was a forgotten story. I used to live in New York. I first came across the Wendels when I was procrastinating one day. I should have been writing an article. I just started surfing the internet and I came across the story of Toby, who I read was the world's richest dog after inheriting his wonderfully eccentric sounding owner, Ella Wendell's fortune. So this really set me on the incredible story of the Wendels. I did some digging around and found this photo of Ella and Toby. And you'll see here, it says, it was actually from the British Daily Express from an article in 1933, which was 2 years after Ella's death. And it's just this incredible story, which turned out to be not true, sadly. Toby did not become a millionaire dog, but he had thousands of pounds lavished on him during Miss Wendell's lifetime. He lived in a room of his own, lay on silk cushions and had priceless linen to lie on. Miss Wendell brought him breakfast in bed every morning. Miss Wendell's death was indeed the tragedy of Toby's life. So when I first heard of them, I asked around friends in New York, did they know this story? Did they know this family? One or two had kind of knew the name vaguely, but weren't really sure why. Most people had never heard of them and certainly did not know the incredible story that I was to discover. And I think what interested me most from the very, very beginning was that at one point they'd been this incredibly rich, famous, powerful family. They owned a huge amount of property in New York, and yet their names had been forgotten. And I was just really fascinated by this, why when other famous families have so many things named after them, had the Wendell name disappeared. And I became obsessed with finding out why they disappeared. So who were the Wendells? Their story begins in America in 1898 when grandfather Johann Gottlieb Wendell arrives in New York off a ship from Altona, Germany. He settled in Lower Manhattan, where he became very friendly with John Jacob Astor I, fellow immigrant, and he joined him in the fur business. And he met and married Astor's half-sister, Elizabeth Astor. They were very friendly, the families. Like Astor, as he made money from fur, Johann Wendell invested his profits in real estate. Obviously, Manhattan back then was much, much smaller than we think of it today. So it was really Lower Manhattan, and so he would buy up property. And the first properties were in Gold Street. In 1800, Elizabeth has a child, John Daniel Wendell, who is the father in this story, Pa Wendell, as he was called by his family. She had two more children, but both of them died in childhood. So John Daniel is the only one who survives to adulthood. Now this is him obviously as a much older man, he marries Mary Ann Jew of Baltimore. He works with his father in the property business, as would have been expected then. And they have 5 basic rules which underpin their business. And these are passed through the generations of Wendell men, which are buy, never sell, never mortgage, improvements carried out by the tenant, and also that Broadway moved 10 blocks north every decade. So obviously in the second half of the 19th century, New York is expanding so fast, demand for property is growing exponentially as we have wave after wave of immigrants coming into the booming city. And John Daniel proves to have a sixth sense for property. After his father's death, he keeps buying pieces of land and properties as much as he can afford. Over time, fur stops being their business and they concentrate purely on real estate. The family bought up a lot of properties on and around Broadway. And in time, they owned more than 150 properties and pieces of land, stretching from the southernmost tip of Manhattan right through what we now call the Lower East Side, the East and West Villages, the Meatpacking District, up to Midtown and the Upper East Side. They also had property in Brooklyn and Queens, in Staten Island, New Jersey, Virginia, and West Virginia. And here we see John Daniel's bride, Mary Ann Jew Wendell, again, taken a bit later in her life. So in the early 50s, early 1850s, John D. Wendell built his family a mansion on Fifth Avenue at the corner of 39th Street. And at the time, he was mocked for building so far north. Most fashionable members of society still lived kind of around 18th Street and below. This section of Fifth Avenue was very far from the fashionable Causeway of Commerce it was going to become. And it was mostly fields. They had some neighbours, but it was mostly fields and unimproved roads around here. Over on 6th, there were taverns, dilapidated shacks. There were tanneries, which you can imagine the stench of being near the tanneries and the wind blowing across. And for children, for sport, kids locally would chase the pigs, which at this time everybody just threw their gutter out into the street and the pigs would root around in it and the kids would chase the pigs over on 6th, certainly, and I guess they would make their way onto 5th. And when the wind blew off the Hudson River, Fifth Avenue became swathed in a pungent fog, which one observer described as a nasal disaster. And I think we can all imagine just quite how disastrous that must have been. So land up here had been considered so worthless that the city was virtually giving it away. So just a decade earlier, they had given for $1 land to build an orphanages and also to build an asylum. And John Daniel, who I'll refer to as both John Daniel, John Sr. and Pa, he didn't listen to his critics. He knows he's going to have the last laugh. His relative and friend, John Jacob Astor, also has been buying land this far north. So the Wendell Mansion at the time is furnished, as you would imagine, of a family of some wealth now, in luxurious style. So they have mantelpieces made of marble, they have silk chaiselongs, assorted rugs that have come from the Orient, bronze and marble statues, and really it's very beautiful, lovely paintings. And they also have an architectural novelty of like a cupola built into the roof that light can come through. So they christened their home. They threw a huge and very lavish housewarming party, and it was attended by all the fine people of the time. Guests included the Astors, the Stuyvesants, the industrialist Peter Cooper, who was a very good friend. His relatives had bought beaver skins to make hats from the Wendels, and fellow landowners, the Gillettes, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, were also there. And in later years, as Chet mentioned this, people talked about the Wendels as recluses and as very weird. I think it's very important to say at this point, they really are not. They are definitely not recluses. They're also not weird. They certainly were modest people. They didn't particularly enjoy the spotlight, as was true of many families at the time, and particularly some of the older money families. They didn't like very ostentatious displays of wealth. But throughout the 19th century, they're throwing lovely parties, dinners, and they enjoy very much socializing with their peers. So the couple between them, they have 8 children who I've listed here, starting with Johann, named after his grandfather, of course, Johann Gottlieb Wendell Jr., who in childhood is known as Johnny. He's born in 1835, and we go down through, they all had nicknames, Henrietta's Henry, and they also all have very grand and rather long names. They're named after assorted friends and relatives, and you can see that they were having children every couple of years. Mary Eliza Astor Wendell, Rebecca Becky Antoinette Jew Wendell, Augusta, Josephine, Georgiana, Georgie, and Ella, Ella Virginia von Etzel Wendell. It's very hard to remember them all. What I will say is that the main characters in this story are Johnny, the only son, also Becky, Ella, and Georgie are the ones you're going to be hearing most about today. So here we have John Jr., Johnny. He benefits from the finest education money can buy in New York's best schools, graduates from Columbia University, and then in 1855, he heads off to following a path well trodden by sons of wealthy Americans, and he goes off to Europe to continue his studies. He, at this time, is known to be, and it's quite clear from his many letters and diaries of the time, which I read, he was very fun-loving, he's adventurous, he loves practical jokes, has a very childish sense of humour, he's very sociable, he's very outgoing. He speaks fluent French, German, Italian, plus some Latin and Greek, which would later come in handy when talking to his family's tenants. He also has an eye for the ladies, and he rather enjoys life on the continent, where he has a bit of distance from a very close-knit family and a very overprotective mother. So he enjoys this, he has freedom to come and go as he pleases, he enjoys flirtations with young women, and it's a less buttoned up existence than the one he had just left in Victorian America. He's much more carefree, he's not being watched all the time. So his parents, they leave him in peace, they supply him with a very generous allowance each month, and he begins to dream of having a career with the diplomatic service. He writes to tell his parents of this. He's now been away for a decade. His parents do not respond well. He's the only son. He's clearly expected to come back and join his father in business. No brothers to help out. So Johnny is stuck. So his dream is over. And this really, having read so many documents written by John and written between him and his family, I think this is really a defining moment for him. He can't do what he wants. He has to come home, and he has to come and be in New York, join his family, and do what's expected of him and work for a business that at this point has absolutely no interest for him. He's holds no interest at all. So he's summoned home. When he left for Europe, his youngest sisters, Georgie and Ella, were just little girls. They were just 4 and 1 year old. So they hardly know each other at this point. And then John comes back into the mix. So here we have Henrietta, Henry. She's a daddy's girl. She's very gentle, very kind. Everybody loves her very much. She dies at a young age, which we'll get to later. Here we have Mary, named after her mother, of course. She's tough, no nonsense kind of character. In later life, we see a lot of her and Ella butting heads. Here we have Becky. She was John's favourite and his greatest ally. In later years, she's a very strong character, very confident. She can be a bit pious and smug and disapproving. She will go on to be the only sibling to marry. We'll get onto that later. And here we see a group shot. Now these, I should say, these portraits most of these date to 1860, when the Wendell family went to visit John Jr. And here we see Josie, Becky, and John. Josie, she's quite reserved. She doesn't particularly enjoy the spotlight. She's quite high strung. Here we see Pa and Ma with Ella, the baby, and Gussie. Gussie, we'll later hear about. She spent a good deal of time in an asylum, and Ella I'm going to come back to in a minute. Here we have Mary, Henrietta, Henry, and Georgie. The Wendell children, obviously, they're brought up in a life of incredible privilege and luxury. They have a box at the Academy of Music. They shop on very fashionable Grand Street. They ride their carriage in the newly created Central Park. And they take extended trips around Europe. And the girls were given a good education. They were mostly educated at home, but they had a good education. As I say, they were often around friends, parents' friends, the children of their parents' friends. And it's worth noting here that obviously the time they were growing up in, and in common with children of other wealthy families, their lives were governed by very strict social expectations, which dictated where they went and with whom. They always had to have a chaperone, of course, the girls. They could only go to places considered suitably respectable, which was, say, to the homes of their parents' friends. They shared the same friends for the most part. It's not an easy context in which to be an individual. They don't really have a great deal of freedom to be themselves. In time, Georgie rebels against this, but as a child, everybody's in childhood, they're rubbing along. Georgie, I have to say, is my favourite of them all. I'm sure she could be really hard work. She was the black sheep. As an adult, she becomes a feminist, a vegetarian. She loves to challenge society's rules and does things which today we take for granted. She rode a bike when it was considered shocking for a woman to do so, particularly a woman of wealth. She delighted as an adult in drinking a bit too much wine, to the horror of her siblings, a number of whom were teetotal. And she just likes to go out and have a good time and shock everyone. Here is Ella, the baby. She's 3 years younger than Georgie, so the two of them are often in class together in the schoolroom. 18 years younger than John. She's very tender-hearted. She's very dreamy, dreams of marrying, having children. She loves animals, is a real country girl. It's quite clear as she grows up that if she could have spent 12 months of the year in Irvington, she would have been delighted to. She just couldn't get enough of the place. But her gentle exterior hides a real steeliness. There's a real toughness to Ella, which is rather admirable in many ways. So John Daniel Wendell had obviously predicted that fashionable society was going to move uptown. We see here that in time, this is indeed what happens. We can see from this, obviously the roads are paved, there's lots of traffic on them, and in time, obviously it got busier and busier. So I've said the Astors moved up shortly after the Wendels, various Vanderbilts appeared, A.T. Stewart, the merchant prince of America, he was one of the earliest people to move up here. William Boss Tweed, notoriously corrupt leader of Tammany Hall, was another early resident. And as the years pass, more and more people come up here. Now, I've got some pictures to show you next of the Wendell mansion. I should say these were taken, the interior pictures, these are taken after Ella's death, so you don't really get any sense at all of the grandeur. It was at the height of fashion when it was built. By this time, the Wendels are dead and the house has really gotten quite tired and shabby. And this is where some of the eccentricity, the kind of things that were said about them came in. They didn't modernise, which was largely down to John. You see this lovely staircase and their tiled floors, and this the statue here, the marble statue, which stood there from the moment they moved in. So by this point, when the picture was taken, it had been there almost 80 years. Here's a picture from a parlour. This is not the Wendell parlour, but it shows a formal parlour, which would have been similar to theirs in style. So we've established they were respectable, they were well liked, they had many friends, they felt most comfortable socialising with the merchant class, which was where most of their friends came from. In time, and by the kind of 1870s, there was one key respect in which the Wendels were not like their friends. And this was that societal expectations dictated that by this point, the sisters would all have been married off, all 7 of them. And in fact, none of them were. Their peers did gossip. The truth was that with just 1 son and 7 daughters, John Daniel Wendell, Pa Wendell, had always been terrified of the fortune hunters that roamed around New York looking for young women of wealth. He'd worried about it quite openly. As he got older, he'd spoken about it in front of his family. And this was something that the whole family had grown up with, this concern. So around the same time that John, Pa Wendell, builds his house in Manhattan, he also gets this Irvington summer house. We can see the family sitting out front there, and they would spend up to 6 months of the year there. Their story really is inextricably linked with Irvington. The whole family, with the possible exception in later life of John Jr., absolutely loved it there. Many important events and moments in their lives took place in Irvington. They tended to refer to Irvington as the country house, while 442 Fifth Avenue was referred to as either 442 or the City House. And they lived a fairly simple country life there. Their house, as I'm sure many of you know, stood on the west side of Broadway. And John Sr. continued to buy up parcels of land in Irvington right up till 1873. And he always added to his original property. And in time came to own a 40-acre estate, which occupied both sides of Broadway. And the Irvington property had a working farm. There were chickens, cows, a cowman. There was a gardener, a handyman, a coachman, and various staff who worked there year round. The family kept a kitchen garden. A very large proportion of what they ate had been grown and raised on the estate at Irvington. And they would take vegetables and dairy products from Irvington back to the city with them. They would also send food parcels to the city. And there are rather lovely letters that Ella would write late in life where she was sending parcels of butter and vegetables, okra, to her friends, and including her lawyer back in the city. And they had many friends in Irvington, including the Whitehouses, who lived, I believe, at the Larches on Cedar Ridge in Irvington, and also the Astors, the relatives. And on a map here, you can see the extent of their property. So it's described here as Miss R.A.D. Wendell. That's because this is from after the father's death, when he left his Irvington property, all of it to Becky. So you can get a sense of the extent of their holdings and their estate. You can see here, it's not a great picture, but you can see the house and this gazebo here, which they all like to sit out in. And here we see the gazebo again with Becky and Mary in the grounds at Irvington. Here we see John Jr. In his buggy in Irvington. And the family, they were a family of dog lovers. So here we see Punch and Judy. They had many dogs over the years, including a series of Tobys. And here we see some more pictures of their dogs. And they loved their dogs and horses so much that they created a pet cemetery in the grounds at Irvington, which we can see some of here. And Ella spent a fortune on having headstones and memorials made for the animals. I'm just going to show you, just to give you a sense, Irvington back then, Main Street around 1900. Also a picture of East Irvington, sometimes called the Four Corners. Many of the Wendell staff and servants worked for them for many, many years. They included coachmen who would often work their entire careers, gardeners, real estate staff, their lawyer, Charles Coss, who we'll touch on very briefly at the end, and William Diaz, who we can see here on the right with the basket. He was a former tenant of the Wendels, and John handpicked him and his brother to come and work for him. He liked to give work to people he knew, and Diaz became his most trusted employee, who basically did anything that John asked for, and later on helped Ella to take care of Irvington when she was very elderly. Here's the Odell Tavern, excuse me, which was on the edge of, of the Wendell residence. And so for the Wendells, life followed the same rhythm every year. It'd come April, they would lock up 442 and they would travel out to the country to escape the city heat. And it was their idyll and their haven. And then in 1876, Henrietta gets diphtheria and she dies very suddenly. This happens at Irvington. The whole family is distraught. They can't bring themselves to move back to the city. They stay on in Irvington. And several months later, Pa Wendell becomes seriously ill and he dies that same year. And the whole family, they're consumed by grief. He had been their rock, their protector, their provider. He was now gone. So they went into mourning. And yes, their previously purely joyous associations with Irvington have now also got a darker element in there. So here we see a page of the draft of Pa Wendell's will. He leaves everybody in the family, his son, his wife, and all his daughters. They each get money, stocks, bonds, and each of them gets a portfolio of property. So though his son gets more than anyone else, the sisters all get a very generous amount too. Ma gets 442, Becky, as I've said, gets the Irvington property, the house and the land. And John, he insists that he'll control everything for everyone. So if they just leave the property with him, he'll look after it all and the money, and he'll make sure that he gives them an allowance each month, drawn from their rental income. So they've had this fear of fortune hunters. He partly wants to control everything because he wants to make sure he can keep a watchful eye on everything his father and grandfather have built up. And over the years, the sisters, they fall in love. They have lots of suitors. We see this particularly with Ella, who's on the brink of marrying a couple of times, and she dates men and keeps it a secret from her family. She gets her sisters to come and be chaperones. And then when she finally plucks up courage to tell her family, they always insist that she calls these romances off. Always saying, the men aren't good enough, they only want her money, or they're not from a good enough background. And in time, obviously, this breeds bitterness and resentment within the Wendell family. So Gussie never really recovers from losing her beloved sister and her father in quick succession. She in time suffers a breakdown, and without consulting any of his sisters, Jory decides that she will go to an asylum. So she's sent to the New York State Homeopathic Asylum in Middletown, New York. Ma has agreed to this. And though it's only 60 miles from Irvington, the family rarely visit her over the years. Her only regular visitor from amongst them is Georgie. Again, John's decision to send Gussie away creates a lot of tension. Georgie in particular really resents it. She repeatedly begs John to bring her home, says that they can care for her. She gets the names of people who can come and look after her in their house. And I think we should stop just for a moment and think about what life must have been like at this point for this family. So here we have 7 children left and their mother, all adults, all or most of them forced to call off romantic attachments with people that they had dreamed of spending their lives with. They're still living in their childhood home with each other well into adulthood. John, by this point, is in his 50s, and just how strange their lives must have been by this point. Of course, is bound to affect you and to cause tension within your family. Arguably, in a bid to escape his family, John buys another summer home at Quogue in Long Island. And the siblings start dividing their time now between the 3 houses, between Irvington, 442 and Quogue. And from their letters, it's very clear that some of them start trying to avoid each other. So if John's in Quogue, the sisters who like him the least, who include Georgie and Ella, will make sure they're in Irvington. And so it goes round and they all kind of circle trying to avoid each other. I should also say actually that because as time goes on, John doesn't like new technology, so he insists that they're not allowed to have a phone. And so they wrote to each other. They had different houses, and so they were constantly writing letters to each other. So barely a day, I don't even know if a single day did go by where one of them wasn't writing to one of the others. And that's why there's this incredible archive of material giving us an incredibly privileged and rare insight into their daily lives. And much of it was very boring. The sisters would correspond about their immovable bowels, but in amongst the kind of, buying a new cowman or the death of a beloved cow, there were these incredibly juicy bits of information too. So we have thousands of their letters which survive. So John often uses work as an excuse when the others are going up to Irvington. He'll stay behind, he needs to work, the business can't possibly run without him, and he enjoys a bit of tomcatting back in Manhattan. And he really resents his sister's freedom by this point, their freedom to travel, to come and go as they please. And so one day, Georgie announces that she and Ella are going to go on a grand tour of Europe. They're going to have an extended tour of a couple of years around Europe and the UK. And just as they're getting ready to leave, we see here the sisters are rather stylish young women, these wonderful hats. John mysteriously just disappears from the city. He doesn't, their trunks have come down from the attic. Everybody knows they've been talking about it for months. He disappears and he doesn't leave them with sufficient funds for the trip. So a family friend helps them out, gives them enough money to tide them over until John returns, and off they go. And this kind of passive aggressive, obstructive behaviour becomes increasingly common, increasingly typical of John as he gets older. He was very jealous that they can travel. He resents them spending money that he says, oh, you know, I've got to stay in Manhattan and work hard to earn this money. So he tries to control them using money. So here we have Ella, and when they're away, John begins an affair. And I should say this picture was taken much later than when the affair began. Becky at this point has broken her knee and she needs someone just to keep her company and to get things for her and just basically run errands for her and be there and keep her company. So he hires Martha, who John knows from the Lower East Side where her family live, invites Martha to come and work, and as he put it, jolly the old maids along in Irvington. So John at this point is 47 years old, and Martha is 16. So when Becky's knee heals, John dismisses Martha, but he continues to pay her. And he says, you know, go back to your family in the Lower East Side. I'll continue to pay you. In fact, in time, he actually increases her wages. And you just need to make yourself available. So it's not his first affair with a servant. However, he is surprised by his depth of feeling for her. So Martha, in turn, begins to fall head over heels in love with John. We see here an extract from her diary. There are some of these diaries I got from the family papers. I was also contacted by somebody who had others who had been related to her side of this story, who sent me lots of other diaries. So she begins by, she says, oh, you know, I've never kept a diary before. What do I write in a diary? And she begins to jot down when he comes to see her, describes their get-togethers, describes him taking her to Coney Island. And over the coming months and years, she records her growing feelings for John. She describes their encounters, which in time become sexual, to begin with their heavy petting, we might describe it as. She also describes her pregnancies and abortions that John tells her she must have. And she tells her diary everything. She has sisters, but she can't tell her sisters. She knows her family disapprove of this relationship. However, they also need the money that John Wendell is providing. So Martha pours it all out into these diaries, and as a result, they are incredibly candid. At one point, we see Hattie as her sister. She says here, Hattie says, I should take poison. What for? Because I love John, and he is dearer to me than anyone in the world. I love him dearly, sorry for the typo, and I'm going to keep him as long as I can. And so this relationship goes on. Sometimes John, at the height of his obsession with Martha, he'll sometimes call on her house 3 times a day. He likes the kind of the idea that he is educating her and will bring her textbooks and help her to improve her family's German. Gets her learning French. And encourages her to read German literature. So in 1892, Mary Wendell Sr., Ma Wendell, dies, and the whole family is really obviously shattered by this. The parents really were the glue that kept the Wendell siblings together, and since childhood, it had fallen to their mother to be their peacemaker. Georgie, in particular, had always been rather protected by her mother. The two women couldn't have been more different, Georgie and her mother. But Ma had a real soft spot for Georgie. And so Ma had been the buffer between John and Georgie, who increasingly just had an intense dislike of each other. Ma had also kept some of John's more controlling tendencies in check. So with her gone, he begins to keep an even closer eye on his sister's comings and goings and also on their finances. Georgie responds by spending more and more time away from her family. She has friends all over the place. She has friends from a very wide mixture of social backgrounds. Her best friend is the Irvington gardener's daughter, who she's obviously known since she was a tiny girl. So she stays with friends in Brooklyn, in the city, and in White Plains. And she also stays in hotels. So if John in particular, and sometimes Becky, because she's not very keen on Becky, if they're at 442, Georgie will usually check into a hotel. So getting back to John and his love life, while he's continuing to see Martha, he's also, oh, sorry, so this is just a bit about them rowing. So while John is continuing to see Martha, he also sees other women, which obviously he's allowed to do, though he expects Martha not to. So this is, some of you may know the Whitehouses. This is Helen Whitehouse, Nellie, as she was known. And he dates Nellie again. She's only 16 when he starts dating her, for a decade. It's obviously not a man to move quickly. And when he still hasn't proposed to her, her family spirit her off to Europe, where she married a doctor in Germany. She ends up divorced, married again, divorced again. She and John remain in contact for the rest of his life. And I think along with Martha, she really was the great love of John's life, though I think Martha is his biggest love. So she writes to him, she addresses him as sweetmeats. He calls her sugar plum. And when the press start to speculate. So there's a lot in the press about John and his girlfriend. There's lots of, will they, won't they tie the knot? When's it going to happen? John and Georgie, meanwhile, relations between them reach a new low around this time. So after their mother's death, Georgie, really, there's nobody to protect her. Ella is kind of loyal to Georgie, but she's not brave enough to stand up to John, and particularly to John and Becky. John and Becky, meanwhile, increasingly think of Georgie as an annoyance and an embarrassment. She does, as I've mentioned, she defies social conventions. She forgoes her corset. She starts selling the family cooks, who are used to making these, they're mostly German, these hearty German stews. She starts selling them to make vegetarian meals for her. She takes up all kinds of experimental health regimes. She follows the Kneipp water cure, which was enjoying a vogue at the time. She takes cold baths, some of which she does in her clothes, which was what Kneipp advised you to do. And she goes out walking barefoot on the lawn at Irvington, all of which is regarded as very odd and eccentric. Worryingly for John, Georgie's always taken a great interest in the family business. She was, even when her father was around, she would go to the estate office and ask to see papers, and her father was delighted that she was so interested. So she starts to demand that John, her brother, gives her control of the money and property that both of her parents left to her. She wants to look after these herself. So John decides that he will take matters into his own hands. He wants to put a stop to what he sees as her lavish spending and her embarrassing antics. And so she's staying in the Park Avenue Hotel, which is just a few blocks from the Wendell mansion. She at this time is 48. She's recently defied one of the basic rules of the Wendell business. She's carried out a very costly renovation of an apartment block in Manhattan that she owns. And she plans to build luxury apartments on a piece of land that she owns in Brooklyn, which John heartily disapproves of. So he decides that, rather than traveling wherever she wants to go and spending all the money, that he's going to do something about this. So, and also importantly at this time, Georgie has learned of his affair with Martha, and he's terribly afraid that she's good for Georgie is very good friends with all the servants, and John is terrified that she might seek to harm his reputation in some way. So one night, some men bundle Georgie out of the Park Avenue Hotel. They bundle into a carriage waiting outside and take her to the insane pavilion at Bellevue, where John has her committed by an alienist, a man by the name of Fitch, obviously the word used at the time for a psychologist. And this very man was exposed a few years before in the New York Times for taking money from wealthy clients to declare their relatives insane and have them locked up without good reason. And this obviously, as I'm sure many of you know, was not uncommon at this time for wealthy, usually men, to have their usually female relatives declared insane if they felt they were being difficult and disagreeable. And several decades earlier, Cornelius Vanderbilt had had his wife committed briefly to Bloomingdale Asylum because she wouldn't move from their house in Staten Island to Manhattan, and then she was released when she agreed. So what follows, excuse me, is a very long battle between Georgie and John, and this goes on for a long time. And her friends, who have basically become like her family, they take up her case and fight really hard to get her freed. Her lawyer, her estate manager all support her, where John persuades and in some cases bullies the other siblings to side with him as he tries to have Georgie locked away permanently. The Wendels, obviously, they've always been a fairly private family. They're not going to get to be private again. You know, they're thrown into the spotlight. There's intense media interest in this. And things reach a new low in the summer of 1900 when Georgie, who had been released for a time, she finds herself imprisoned in the Irvington house. And she's held there for months under John's orders. The other people in the house, obviously, their servants, also Mary and Ella are both there. They had no part in the decision to imprison her, but John tells them that it's their job to keep an eye on her, and no other members of the family are there. Very occasionally, John or Becky pop in, but for the most part, it's Georgie, Ella, and Mary. And there's really awful description in court testimony and other papers about how Georgie was strapped to a cot, like a little camp bed in the attic, and the nurses forcibly injected her with strychnine and morphine to sedate her. And she's watched over night and day by nurses and security guards who John has hired. He has alienists come up and tell her how ill she is. At one point, her friends actually come, which this article tells you about here. They come to try and set her free. And the story of her imprisonment here in Irvington reaches all the papers, obviously. So I would go into more detail about that because it's such an interesting episode, but let's move on to the next slide. So John, who's always very, very careful with his money, and he has, probably because he resents his sister spending it so much, he's become quite tight with his money now, though he does spend an absolute fortune on having beautiful suits made for himself. He'll get half a dozen suits made at the same time from Harris tweed from Scotland, which he gets made up in London and then sent to him. And he'll buy the whole bolt of cloth so that nobody else can have the same material as him. So he hires, despite the fact that he can be careful with his money, he spends an absolute fortune trying to get Georgie declared insane again. He gets the very best lawyers in the city. They have an army of alienists, nurses, doctors, and Wendell employees testifying in court that Georgie is mad. The doctor, Fitch, he briefs them all about what they must say. It's made clear to the staff, some of whom testify against Georgie, that if they don't go along with it, they'll lose their positions. And here we've got an extract from one of the nurses' testimony when she describes her getting very violent, tearing at her, scratching her, biting me, foaming at the mouth. She also talks about how Georgie said she could communicate with the police from her head, and how she would hang out the window shouting and screaming. So there's this picture forming of Georgie as this clearly insane person, and then everybody gets a surprise in October 1900 when Georgie appears in court. She gives very coherent testimony. She gives very compelling testimony. She's got a slight kind of nervous tic, and kind of moves her head side to side, which her lawyer says explains to the court this is as a result of being persecuted by her family. And she says that her brother and her sister Becky want to have her locked up because they want to have control of her property. And then finally, in December 1900, her lawyer is successful in having her released. So she's absolutely terrified as to what her family might do and that her brother is going to try and lock her up again. So she flees to Europe so that she can hide from them there. And John and Becky are delighted to be rid of her. Around the same time, John moves the family real estate office, which had always been in Maiden Lane, to the Germania building at 175 Broadway, which you can see here on the right under the Waltham Watches sign. And then there's another picture here. You can see it's the building on the left, in the picture on the left. And then again, as it looks today, It's now part of the offices for the Century 21 department store. So Georgie, she can't put her siblings' cruel treatment of her out of her mind. She really is tormented by it. So she writes to her lawyer in New York and tells him to sue John for false imprisonment. She demands damages, and also she gets her lawyer to demand that he hands over everything. She's convinced that John is still holding things from her that her parent left to her. She accuses him of stealing and of concealing the full extent of her inheritance. And this case runs on for years. And then next we have Becky surprises everyone. She announces at age 60 that she's going to be married. Her fiance, who we see here on the camel, is Luther Swope, and they'd got to know each other at church. And he's been quietly wooing her for years. He makes a living tutoring the sons of some of New York's richest residents. And her siblings, true to form, they all try to persuade her to give him up, obviously before this picture was taken. Ella obviously had been forced to call off numerous romances before. She's absolutely furious. She was constantly told that men weren't good enough for her. So she says, come on, Becky. What is this about? He's not your equal. So I've got a letter here. Ella writes to Becky, he is not your equal. Give him up. There are good fish in the sea as ever there was caught. His dress suit can be changed for an everyday suit if it has been ordered. Don't you remember you told me once that I did not have to marry a man because he visited at the house? Seems you do. All your life you have thought no one was good enough for you. And then we get John, who hardly ever challenged Becky. Everybody's slightly in awe of Becky. He takes up his pen, and I think we get an insight into some of his attitudes towards marriage. He writes, well, Becky, you've waited all these years and have been happy. Why marry now? Wouldn't it be better to go on the way you have been and not change your way of living at your age? And the chorus of objections grew. It was quite astonishing. There are so many letters. So friends write, distant relatives write, even the servants have a view. And these views are passed on mostly by Ella in her letters. So Becky obviously ignores them all, and she married on June the 30th, 1903, becoming the first and last of the Wendell siblings to marry. And here we see they go on honeymoon, where they're joined by Ella, who sits there on the donkey. And despite her objections to the wedding, she's obviously happy to go on the honeymoon. So even now in marriage, there's no escaping the Wendels. They've got to tag along on your honeymoon. And here we see the Swopes. So John, despite his objections, he gifted the newlyweds a beautiful home at Central Park West, this building here that we see, this red building. And it's really interesting that at this point, this house is so grand and so beautiful and luxurious compared to the Wendell mansion. But that's John's gift to his favourite sister. So Georgie is still travelling around in Europe. To Becky and John's relief, she hadn't come back for the wedding, and she winds up in a sanatorium in Kiel, the Park Sanatorium, and they find an address in Georgie's belongings, and they write to Becky to say she's well enough to come back. She just seems to have frayed nerves. She's really tired, seems a bit depressed, but she's well enough to come back to America. Could one of you come to get her? And there's a definite tone in this letter of, surely you must love her enough to come and get your sister who's all alone in Europe. Becky, she, afraid her sister's going to come back and cause a scandal, she writes to Georgie, trying to persuade her not to come home, but to stay in Europe, where she is, quote, so well taken care of and not bothered with the lawyers and money suckers who swarm around you in New York. So the Wendell mansion we see at this point, they're increasingly out of step with the city around them. This stretch of Fifth Avenue, by this point in the story, is a really busy commercial thoroughfare. There's lots of pedestrians. You'll see around their house on 39th that had been has had to be paved over, so as the pavements, and on Fifth, as the pavements were widened, it all had to get filled in. Previously, there was light, it was an empty gap, and light would come into the basement below. So most of their wealthy neighbours by this point have moved uptown, obviously up further up Fifth and around there, to be close to Central Park. The Wendels now, early 20th century, they've got new neighbours, they've got towering department stores popping up around them. They've got the New York Public Library just a block up, the Schwartzman building, as we know it now. There's the Algonquin Hotel has opened for business a few blocks away. And Manhattan is really changing, obviously. We've got skyscrapers of the type John Wendell absolutely hated, are now being thrown up all over the city. And the skyline is really changing with these bold, innovative creations. Get the Flatiron, the Home Life Insurance Building, the New York Times buildings. And then in 1904, we get the first underground line of the subway opening, which fueled the biggest building boom in New York history. Inside 442, life remains resolutely unchanged. And you'll see here, there was a lot said about how the Wendell shutters were all shut and the drapes were drawn. This had not been the case, but as the sidewalk came closer to their house after their dry moat was filled in, they started closing up the shutters and the curtains on the bottom floor. So this idea about them being reclusive and hidden away, I think a lot of it is due to that and just the appearance of that lower floor of the house. So John, he still doesn't see any need to install a telephone, an elevator, even hot running water, which you might have thought would be a basic. He doesn't see the appeal of electricity. Gas lighting is so much more gentle on their eyes. So while John, at this point in the house, there's John, Mary, Josie, and Ella. They're padding around in the gloom, and real estate men are greedily eyeing both the house, which they want to tear down and replace with something much taller, and also this yard, which just, it was this huge lot, bigger than the house, lying empty. It was a complete oddity in this part of Manhattan. And the last unimproved lot in this, the most in-demand district of the city. So John is asked to name his price. He says with a straight face he won't sell the yard. Ella uses it to exercise her poodle Toby. At this point, Ella doesn't particularly like going out into Manhattan because obviously where they are is really congested. She often does take Toby out for exercise in the yard. This wasn't the reason John wouldn't sell. He was just joking. He loved to be contrary, he loved to joke around. But this idea of the $1 million playground becomes a very popular New York myth, and I guess, evidence of the extravagance, the terrific extravagance of the rich. Lord and Taylor were among those who wanted to buy the land that the Wendell home stood on. They offered him millions for 442. He turned them down. And then they moved in next door, sadly, Lord and Taylor, which has now disappeared. The sisters would complain at night that the lights from the department stores kept them awake at night. They couldn't see because they were so bright. On New Year's Day, 1912, here's another. Let's look out to their stables. They're that two-story building. On New Year's Day, 1912, they get word that Gussie has died, and she's been in the asylum by this point for more than 30 years without a visit from John. And I found it incredibly moving that her nurses had written to the sisters asking them to send new clothes before her death, in children's sizes because she'd got so small. So she spent 30 years, more than 30 years in the asylum. Georgie, who really felt terrible about her being put away like this, she was tormented by guilt. She really felt, could she have done anything else? Could she have somehow persuaded John or sprung her out of the asylum? And she couldn't. So as the years go by, 442 becomes a stop on the tour bus circuit, as we see here, 2 tour buses parked outside, and guides would tell stories about the eccentric millionaires within and this $1 million dog playground. And then, so Georgie, she never really fully recovers after her huge battle with John. She does come back to 442. She's kind of broken by this point. And then she later goes off to live in a sanatorium where she's visited by friends, but not by her family. And then Mary and Ella spend most of their time together now. So they're by now as near to being full-time Irvington residents as they possibly can be. So they kind of move together between Irvington and 442. They bicker and bicker and bicker away. They seem not to have been able to live without each other, but at the same time, they just seem to get on each other's nerves. So Ella thinks Mary's very lazy. She complains that Ella has to do all the look after the house and look after the staff and hiring people and letting them go. Whereas Mary complains in letters to the same siblings that Ella's complaining about Mary, that Ella's just bossy. And she wishes she would just give her some peace. Josie, who we haven't heard a great deal about, she became very anxious and withdrawn. She was very badly affected by the fights between her siblings. She consults with the Christian Scientists for a time, sends them money, and they promise that they'll pray for her. In later life, she moves in with the Swopes. So again, the Swopes, their honeymoon is well and truly over by this point, when they've got another member of the family coming to move in with them. Martha, this is Martha later in life. She, after a number of abortions, she ends up having John's baby. John does what he thinks of as the decent thing, and finds a man to marry her and pose as the baby's father. They go off to California, and in later years, John visits her every winter. He goes to see his lover and son. And, he's very far from an ideal romantic partner, but he is true to his word that he will provide for her and care for her. And he does in his own unique way. He sends them money. He sends money to Martha's husband, but I guess sensing that probably this marriage isn't going to be a happy one, because how could it be? He also sends, secretly, he sends Martha money too, which she squirrels away for her and the boy. So in 1914, John is on his way to visit Martha and their son, and he's stricken with paralysis on the train from New York. So Martha nurses him night and day, and he dies on November the 30th, 1914. His death makes news in papers across America and indeed across the globe. As you might expect, opinion is really divided as to whether he's been a good or a bad thing for the development of Manhattan. There are lots and lots of critics, but some people describe him as a kind of a unique New Yorker that the city really needs to give it that wonderful, unique quality that New York has. So, excuse me, here we see crusty bachelor who died yesterday, 80 years old, did his own errands, would not sell land, which was true. Again, that story being repeated, even kept a $1 million Fifth Avenue plot for Dog's Playground. John G. Wendell, the man who would not sell, unique figure in the real estate world. So one by one, we see the other siblings dying. So John dies, the sisters die. And despite their very conflicted feelings about each other in life, they all leave each other everything, or virtually everything, in their wills, as their father would have wanted. So in 1929, Georgie dies. So she didn't really care for most of her relatives. Everything went to them. Becky dies in 1930, until only Ella is left. And this is the attic room in 442, where she would spend a lot of time looking through trunks full of all their childhood possessions. Ella herself dies in 1931, and it was reported all over the world, as you would expect. Lass Wendell dies in her New York City home. Family is surrounded by legends. So there's a lot of speculation, as you can imagine, as to who would get her fortune. Her lawyer makes the mistake of saying that she died without heirs. And the next thing, there is this kind of gold rush as people, it's obviously by this point, it's the depths of the Great Depression. So from all over the world, people appear to say, well, actually, I had a connection with the Wendels. And I mean, some of them are literally, a man writes a postcard, I think I may be connected to the Wendels, and sends it off with his name and address. So obviously most of them are bogus. In total, 2,303 people come forward to make a claim on the estate, more than 100 lawyers involved. And then the battle over their money, it takes some extraordinary twists and turns, which I do explore in the book. Don't have time to get into it today. Just suffice to say, that there was an heir and there were some distant relatives. If you want to know more about John's the secret child and how I found out about him, then that's all in Curse of Riches. And here we see another article from the time. N comes to Miss Ella in sleep in Old Fifth Avenue mansion. And as I said earlier, you know, many of the ideas which persist about the Wendels being weird and eccentric and reclusive, there was maybe an element of truth. I mean, in her old age, Ella didn't enjoy going out in Manhattan. She would have much rather stay in Irvington. She didn't even particularly enjoy going out in Irvington anymore. But there were stories of her as this lady that never left the house and who always pushed her dog around in a baby carriage. And she was seen pushing her dog around in a baby carriage, but that was when he was poorly and it wasn't something she'd done all the time. And a lot of these stories about how weird they were came from people trying to contest the will, and they presented her as, you know, not in control of her faculties, but as someone who was being preyed on by lawyers and hangers on and heads of institutions that wanted to get her money. But she was an old lady who was out of step with the times, and she'd very quietly withdrawn from society to live with her maid who'd been with her for years, and also her beloved dog Toby. And I should say there were many Tobys. They all started out their lives with different names, but they were all white Maltese poodles. They all reminded her of the original Toby, so they all in time became Toby. And I think, you know, it's perhaps no coincidence that her last Toby had been a gift from her bank manager in Irvington. You can see she was, by the end, being preyed upon by people who wanted her money. So the papers tell all sorts of ancient and exaggerated stories about the Wendels. And here we see another one about her being odd and reclusive. They also paid tribute to a fabulous family. And again, there were all sorts of stories told about them in these articles, some of which were true, some weren't, and sometimes it's a job to separate fact from fiction. So Toby, as I mentioned earlier, sadly did not become a millionaire. Virtually all of the Wendell money went to charities and to Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, and also to religious organizations. Some of the Wendels had been very religious and had attended church very regularly. Ella wasn't particularly by the end, and so there were some suspicions as to how she'd ended up leaving so much money to the church, and also to Drew, a Methodist university. Now, Ella, in giving away, estimates vary as to how much the fortune was. It was the Depression, and so the value of all the property they owned in Manhattan had obviously changed over time. She could very easily, with the amount of money she left, have ensured her name, her family's name, lived on forever by insisting on naming rights like the Wendell's peers did, families like the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Coopers, Carnegie, and so on, who had hospital wings, universities, concert halls, streets named after them. But Ella, interestingly, disposed of the fortune with no strings attached. I think by this point, she's just not interested in her money. She has no real sense of how much she's worth and has no real interest in it. So, you know, they didn't want to use their money to buy immortality. There had never been, a number of them died without wills. So everything ended up in the family. They just, for all they clung on to everything that they owned and were so afraid of the fortune and the family being broken up, they made no plans for what would happen next. John obviously had a son. Had he claimed him as his son, the money could have gone to him, the business could have gone to him. And I think, you know, it was the Wendell way to choose to disappear without trace. And that for me is really fascinating, particularly in today's age where everybody's obsessed with celebrity and immortality. So after Ella's death, Toby, who we see here on the left, he has to give up his life of luxury and spends his days in the basement of 442 with Ella's former maid and a caretaker. The daughter of the longtime Wendell lawyer, Isabel Coss Murray, who inherits a lot. She'd promised to care for Toby, but she's a cat person. She's got lots of cats. So in time, he's put to sleep. He's not looked after by her. Isabel inherited the Irvington house, and she I think many of you may know that house today. She inherits the Wendell house in Irvington and then bulldozes it. And she and her husband built a new house, which became known as the Murray Mansion, which I understand is now there's a private clinic there. Drew University, who I've mentioned before, they inherited 442 Fifth Avenue. And despite Ella asking that it remain intact as a memorial to her parents, it also is bulldozed, the land is sold, and a skyscraper of the type the Wendels loathe was erected on the site. So here we see more pictures. Again, these are taken after Ella's death, but it gives you a sense of how they'd been living just before their death. I mean, it couldn't look further from luxury. It's very Spartan. Obviously, a number of the possessions will have been taken away by now, but we see this very basic, rather depressing looking interior. So all that remains of the family today is this plaque, which some of you may have noticed. I had walked by their home many, many times without noticing this because it's set back slightly from the sidewalk in a doorway. And then as soon as I began researching them, I went to seek it out. So the only things that remain of them, apart from their papers, are this plaque, their pet cemetery in Irvington, and the building which housed their real estate office. And I think, excuse me, my throat's drying out. I'd just like to leave by saying, I think it's very easy for us to mock and ridicule a family like the Wendels, who they were so rich they could have had anything, but instead they kind of tore each other apart. But they were, that last generation of the family were really thrust into that world. They had very little say over the major decisions in their own lives. They couldn't choose their romantic partners. John Wendell, the son, he couldn't even choose his career. He had to join his father in business. He couldn't obviously have admitted to having had a son out of wedlock and with the maid. They couldn't even choose their own friends. Even their friends were chosen for them. And I think society placed so many constraints on them, as it did on all children of wealth and to an extent those not with wealth. And so did the Wendell family. They placed so many constraints on each other. And most of these children, as they started out as very good and likable people. Some of them stayed that way to the end. And they really didn't, to my mind, deserve the misery that their wealth and their position brought them. And the more I got to know them, reading their diaries, their letters, their business ledgers, there are thousands of these things. I really felt tremendous pity and compassion for them. So I hope with this talk and in writing the book I've written, we might be able to slightly rehabilitate their reputation so that they're not just the weird Wendels anymore. So yes, so I'm happy to take some questions now.
Claire, thank you so much for that absolutely wonderful talk. It's just really so fascinating to hear about the craziness of the Wendels. We do have time for a couple of questions. As I mentioned before, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. One question I'd like to start off with, Claire, would be, I know that 442 was given to Drew Theological University. What was the connection between the Wendels and Drew? Why did they end up with their papers and so much of their property?
Yeah, so it was people in the early days of Drew had been friends of the mother and father of Ma and Pa Wendell, and the family had been great friends with Esther Squire Tipple is one of them, and they had, they'd been amongst their social group. I think latterly they were representatives of Drew, which obviously a Methodist university, had frequently called on Ella and the other sisters. So I think they were probably making sure they stayed in with the family, but it was a long friendship. And when each of the siblings died, money would be given to Drew in honor of that sibling.
Mm-hmm. One question in the chat: what happened to John's son, who was in California? Where did he end up?
Yeah, so John's son married, and he had a son. He was raised by a man who was an architect, who obviously posed as his father. The son also became an architect. and stayed in California, and had a very, he was very well off, largely because of Wendell money. I mean, they weren't on a par with the Wendels, but they had beautiful homes by the waterfront, and a ship, lovely cars, beautiful automobiles. So yes, so the Wendell money set them up in good style.
Did they, so a question, did Martha and John's son inherit any of the money once Ella died, or was it just, or just the money that John gave him while he was alive?
Well, so this is a really interesting story. So John secretly gave Ella some money. So basically, Martha does not tell her son who his father is until the very, very end. And when she's reading about all these people who have no connection to the family making claims on the estate, she cracks and she tells her son, who his father is. So they end up being given hush money rather than a generous amount of money.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You mentioned in the talk, another question, when you said Martha had abortions. That was obviously something that was not publicly spoken about. Was that ever mentioned in public documents, the papers, or was it just something that you learned about in reading some of the private letters?
No. And I mean, to be honest, it was me that discovered that Martha had this long affair with John, and that she had a son by him. So until I came along and did this, it had never been revealed. And she talks in diaries and letters about being given potions to take. And also, people connected to the family obviously knew some details about it and worked very hard to keep it quiet.
Another question about John's real son. After any later time, did any of his relatives ever try to go back and collect any of this? Like, there's a question given, did the descendants of John's real son ever challenge the financial outcome, or at least want to become connected to the Wendell family?
I actually got in touch with so John Wendell's grandson. I wrote to him just saying I was researching the family and believed this was very early on in my research, and that I believed his family had a connection to the Wendell family, and I wondered if we could talk. I didn't hear back from him, and I persisted. Every few months I would call a number that I got for him. I'd written him a letter, and then I discovered that one day I called the nursing home where he was, and he had died just the day before I phoned again. So he died without knowing, I believe, of his connection to the family, John's grandson.
Another question, why was Georgie your favorite? You mentioned earlier your talk.
Yeah, I guess because she's such a modern woman. I'm sure she was a handful, and she obviously, she did become a bit unbalanced because of the terrible treatment she suffered. I think I felt quite protective of her because of the terrible bullying that she suffered. She's just a larger-than-life character who, had she been born today, could have had a really lovely life, but she was born, 150 years too early.
Mm-hmm. And what became of Becky's husband, Mr. Swopes? Do you know?
Yes, so they had a very lovely life together. He seemed to be very tolerant of the drama that came with the Wendell family at times. They had a very happy marriage, and he died just a few years before Becky. And they spent a lot of time laterally in Quogue, while Ella seemed to spend most of her time at Irvington.
Just a question about you and your research. How much time did you spend researching the Wendels? How long did it take you to develop this book? Your knowledge is incredible.
Far too long. So I first came across them, would it now be 8 or 9 years ago? And it took me solidly 5-6 years to go through. I mean, there were so many papers of theirs that I read, and I just, I'm a completist, unfortunately, so I couldn't leave anything not read. And I should say I was helped by archivists at Drew, who, I got lots and lots of stuff when I was at Drew, and I made lots of copies of things, and occasionally there would be something that I needed that I didn't have, and they were wonderful at sending me images of files that I hadn't scooped up when I was there. But it really became a labour of love, and I'm sure I drove everybody close to me completely mad talking about the Wendels as if they were still alive.
So time for one more question, and then I think we need to finish up. Just if you know, and I don't know whether you saw what if there's the impact the Wendels had on Irvington. Do you have any? Does your research reveal anything about that?
Gosh, not really. And I don't know how generous they were about giving money away locally. I mean, they all had pet causes that they gave money to. So my guess would be that they would have done quite the extent of that. You know, I would love to know if there's anybody who knows a bit more about it than me, and it probably is something I'll keep digging around to find out an answer to that.
Okay, so we've been going for a bit. If I can, maybe I can ask Veronica Gedrich just to come on to say a couple of closing thoughts and just thank everybody for attending today. Veronica.
Hi, I think I'm on, right? I
get that. You are.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Claire. What a story you tell. I'm sure we all enjoyed it. And thank you for joining us today, everyone. I'm Veronica Gedrich, president of the Irvington Historical Society. And I'd just like to give you a heads up on what we're working on for the coming months. We'll be ending the season with one more virtual presentation. This one by Barbara Davis, co-director of the Westchester County Historical Society, who will be speaking about the history of Westchester parks. This one will be on July 16th at 4 p.m. And don't forget to register for it on our website, irvingtonhistoricalsociety.org.